Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is actually our last class of the semester before the final exam. So, this is our class for Wednesday, the 5th of May, where we are talking about Get Out, which perhaps is my favorite of the films that we have done over the course of the semester. In fact, it was that particular film that inspired me to devote this class to the topic of horror films. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about our last few chapters. And that would be in horror films, Spooky Sounds and the Colors of Fear, chapter 7 and 8. And also in Nightmares, there's a great filmography there. Obviously, we couldn't see all horror films that have significant cultural and social significance. What I try to do was to pick a film that could be representational of that particular decade and also could be extrapolated to talk about our current and contemporary times. But if you wanted a good list of horror films, then I encourage you to look in the filmography in Nightmares. Get Out is kind of unusual in a number of ways. The first, it's a mixture of horror and comedy. Jordan Peele, comedian, wrote the screenplay, and he won an Academy Award for it for original screenplay. He was actually the first black winner for that. And that's something that we've been talking about over the course of the semester is the invisibility of the African American in American horror film and even German horror film, because ultimately we began with the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And when those characters are in horror film, they usually are very small roles. They serve as comedic relief, and they oftentimes are the characters that are killed. And we get a very different kind of scenario in Jordan Peele's piece, which is definitely a commentary on racism in the 2010s, a time period where there were conversations that perhaps America had moved beyond some of its ugly past of racism after it had basically put an African American into the presidency. And this was Jordan Peele's way of saying that the racism was quite alive and well. It was just perhaps subtly hidden, or maybe not so subtly hidden. And I think that we see that now that we fast forward to 2021, and that the true monster, the true American monster, is racism. And until we come to grips with our history of slavery, that monster will continue to live on and will not be killed. The idea of a microaggression, that these small little slights that occur on a daily basis to people of color, and we see that as a representation of how oftentimes these microaggressions can hide macroaggressions. And of course, as we see the film, we find out the insidious plot that's going on in terms of transplantation, of putting the minds of Caucasians into younger African American bodies. In some ways, it's quite reminiscent of the idea of eugenics and trying to find the perfect human being of physicality and intellect. But certainly, we get this ignorant, awkward, liberal elite representation in the film, and this sense of the new modern slavery. And of course, we've talked about that in contemporary times when we've talked about that from a political and from an economic perspective. In this particular film, it's basically taken a step further with the idea of not having autonomy over oneself, which is another commentary about the idea of discrimination and prejudice within our society. There's a good amount of punning with the idea of Get Out. I mean, obviously, the idea is that our characters have to get out of that situation, and embedded within that is the idea of how can America itself get out of its ugly history of slavery and discrimination and prejudice. But oftentimes it's used as an expression, a slang or informal expression of disbelief. disbelief, sort of saying, "Get out! Like that can't be possible." And oh yes, it's quite possible. And that also is another commentary as well, that oftentimes individuals of color, their lived experience happens to be negated and questioned, that that can't be possible, the discriminations and the slights that they are experiencing. But as we see in this film, they are indeed very possible. And it begins with, we get an African American character who's definitely out of his element as he's walking around in white suburbia. And in this particular instance, there is that sense of anxiety and danger as that white car pulls up to him. And this is all very deliberate. The symbolism that Jordan Peele uses, every time I watch this film, I find more and more elements embedded within it. Another film that I could recommend, actually, by Jordan Peele is a new film that, well, it was a new film, approximately a year and a half ago or so. Us is a very well done film, and Jordan Peele is a great fan of horror fiction and horror film, and I suspect he's going to be an up and coming talent. And I think we can see that right from the very beginning, when we get our character of Chris happens to be a photographer. The idea is that he can see and visualize what other people cannot see. And we find out, of course, that he's dating a Caucasian woman, Rose. Good amount of foreshadowing at the very beginning of the film. Rose is selecting sweets, this idea that she's going to be consuming them almost in the way that she is selecting blacks in order to consume them. Chris cuts himself while he's shaving with white shaving cream. You know, the idea that white is dangerous. Rose's father is a collector of treasures, and we see that this is his way of collecting treasures, is collecting African Americans. And he even talks about black molds in the basement. The idea that's how he sees black individuals, as something that is insidious and something that needs to be destroyed. We see references to deer throughout the film. The stuffed lions and the deer are supposed to represent prey, and that they are a substitute for African Americans. Basically, we see that also with the way that that Chris responds to the incident at the very beginning, when they run over a deer, that his first response is to try to seek help and to try to, in one way or another, do the right thing. And of course, they're stopped by a police officer, and Rose is there trying to act as if she's defending him. Of course, it's within her interest not to be questioned too carefully, because ultimately she doesn't want documentation that she and Chris are together, because she has an insidious plot in place for her. We know that Chris, as a child, had a very traumatic incident occur to him with his mother, and that's one of the things that Rose's family is able to manipulate and use to their benefit. Chris is paralyzed by fear as a child when he's watching television. And this idea of television being this kind of hypnotic force, which again we see with the idea of Rose's parents, particularly her mother, where she's using that silver spoon to use that hypnotic sound against the teacup. You know, and the idea of the silver spoon is supposed to represent class and privilege. And we certainly see that when the family, or when Rose and Chris drive up to the family's home, which is basically a mansion. The irony in the film also, I think, is quite well done. For instance, one of the ways that Chris is able to resist some of the hypnotism that's going on later on in the film is that he's able to put cotton in his ears. And there's a long history of African Americans being used in slavery for cotton. Of course, there's the symbolism as well of the color imagery of cotton. But in this way, Chris subverts the cotton and uses it to his benefit rather than to his detriment, as he's trying to avoid that sunken place. And that too is symbolic for the marginalization and the oppression that people of color experience and are oftentimes subjected to in society. The poetic justice at the end, where basically Rose dies alone on the street. It's very similar to what would have happened to Chris's mother. And I had asked you last class to watch the alternate ending. Jordan Peele decided that the alternate ending, in which Chris is ultimately incarcerated, was just a little bit too dark. But as many of you indicated, it was probably the most realistic ending, that despite the horrors that have occurred to Chris, that the law enforcement would never give him an opportunity to defend himself, and he would never have an opportunity to get justice. So what we get instead, the ending that Jordan Peele wanted, was that the best friend would save Chris. And I think there's some commentary in there as well. The idea that within one's community is ultimately the place, if one is a person of color, that one is going to find safety and salvation. Many of the messages in this film are messages that are pretty obvious, that minorities and people of color perceive the truth, but they're continually told they're wrong in their perceptions. And I had mentioned this earlier, and Chris is very articulate when he talks to Rose, asking, questioning, does your family know about me and my skin color and my ethnicity, because this is going to be a problem. Chris is quite aware of the reality of the situation in which he lives. This idea of what is it like to be black in the United States, and regardless of the ending that we get, the reality is that there will be obvious and subtle racism for all individuals of color. So even that, quote, happy ending where Chris is saved is undermined, because he's going to continue to experience subtle racism at the very least, if not obvious racism. When the blind man says to Chris that really all he's interested in is Chris's artistic abilities, that he's colorblind, that's also another commentary about how oftentimes individuals say that they don't see color, but that really can't be a reality when you think about the social constructs of our society. There is no such thing as colorblind. And stating that one has no prejudice probably means that there is at least some level of bias. If nothing else, there is an inability to acknowledge the oppression that has occurred and the discrimination that has occurred, that has put individuals at a disadvantage. So this sense of being trapped or controlled in a white person's mind is very similar to being trapped or controlled in a white person's world. And I think that this film, in many ways, is a film that is quite powerful in terms of how it was able to, in some ways, predict what would happen to us politically after the ending of Barack Obama's presidency, and some of the vitriol and harsh pushback that occurred in terms of race and other isms as well. When we think about spooky sounds and the colors of film, about sound and color and in horror film, and some of you have mentioned this in some of your attendance questions, that some of the musical scores have become nothing short of iconic in our society. You think about the theme to Halloween, for instance, or the Psycho sounds of the stabbing. And the same with 28 Days Later, which I don't think I had a chance to mention, that their soundtrack is actually quite good, in my opinion. And they move from times of dead silence to to jarring noise. It's something that The Exorcist does very effectively as well. But I think that the soundtrack to 28 Days Later is a much more lyrical one. The soundtrack to The Exorcist was meant to be disturbing, and we had talked about how it was actually layered subliminally with other sounds in order to disorient the viewer. But color and sound is quite important. The idea of our senses, and again, the idea of Get Out, dealing with the issue of color, in this particular instance, ethnicity, I think is one that should be examined in a little bit more depth than perhaps it has been in the past. That color isn't just something that influences our environment. Color is oftentimes something that influences the way we interact with each other. And that said, we didn't have a whole lot of time this semester to talk about cross platforms. I mentioned previously how some of the films that we have viewed have been based on novels, probably Dracula being the most famous by Bram Stoker. And of course, the film took its liberties. The Exorcist, another novel, Gothic novel, which is how we began the semester, and we talked about it. But certainly, video games have had a huge impact in horror and vice versa. And if you think about video games that have basically been created based on successful horror films, or video games that have helped inspire horror films so that it could go in either direction. And if you wanted to think about the idea of television as well, in that oftentimes TV has been a vehicle in which we have been able to examine horror. I think about something like not 28 Days Later. I think about something like The Walking Dead. Then how ultimately, as a television series, it broke records, and for a while it was the #1 scripted television series. It was even breaking records against Monday Night Football, which was absolutely unheard of. And this was in the heyday of The Walking Dead and the zombie phenomenon that was in part, influenced by 28 Days Later, but really it was created by the idea of George Romero and Robert Kirkman, who is responsible for the comic books that helped to inspire 28 Days Later, or I'm sorry, that it helped to inspire The Walking Dead. Talks a little bit about how he's so indebted to George Romero that story never could have existed without George Romero's conception of the idea of zombie. So you can see how novels and comic books and video games and even radio, you think about some of the old radio plays that oftentimes address things like horror. And perhaps the most famous example of that would be the Orson Welles broadcast of Martians attacking, or supposedly attacking. And basically, the audience at the time was so horrified because they believed that what they were listening to was a real radio broadcast, War of the Worlds. And it basically, he adapted it from a novel from H.G. Wells, no relation to Orson Welles. They just happen to share the same last name. But he adapted it so that it sounded like they were a series of news broadcasts. And again, this was a time period where there weren't many options. This was the 1940s, so there weren't many options for other media vehicles. And Orson Welles was quite clever in the way that he put together his radio program, and that he announced at the very beginning that it was fictional, but then he didn't make any announcements until the very ending. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why the federal administration intervened at that point and decided that they needed to have regulations and guidelines about how it would be important for radio stations to indicate their broadcasting every 15 minutes or so. So the FAA did that, and it was in direct response to the War of the Worlds broadcast that frightened audiences so much that ultimately some people actually committed suicide. thinking that that would be the better alternative to actually being taken over by Martians. It's something that I talk about in more depth in my media class that I teach in the second summer session, Media and Popular Culture. So if you are interested in continuing conversations about media and popular culture in a more general way, there is a course that I offer in second summer session where we talk about radio and novel and television and video games, and all of those are separate units. As you know, this class was more targeted on the thematic idea of horror film and how these films do more than try to entertain or try to do more than scare. They expose the fears and the anxieties of a populace during a particular time period. And I think we could see that over the course of the semester. And I'm not sure necessarily what film will be the film that will be representational for the 2020s. We are still early in the decade, and there have been conversations about how horror in general, both in written and film form, doesn't have much appeal to audiences when they are in the midst of true horror. And we know that ultimately we are in the midst of a virus, how that will influence our appetite, let's say, for fictionalized horror has yet to be seen. But if Jordan Peele is any kind of indicator, and he's planning on continuing his examinations of horror film, my suspicion is that he might also be the filmmaker of the 2020s as well as the 2010s. He also had actually a television series that he worked on entitled Lovecraft Country that just came out that I watched recently and I can highly recommend. And that was also based on a novel as well. So, in terms of thinking about where we are in the semester, our final project would be due on the 12th of May. That's Wednesday, next Wednesday at 6 p.m. That is the day of our final exam. And the final exam will be posted on the 12th Wednesday by 6 p.m. and it'll be due 24 hours later. So if we were taking the examination in class, basically you would have 3 hours or so to take that examination. So I would suggest that you spend approximately 3 hours or so working on the exam. I don't expect you to be spending 24 hours working on that exam. The idea behind the exam is that you are going to be given several essay questions about themes or ideas that we have examined over the course of the semester, and that this is your way to synthesize what we've discussed over the course of the semester. And it's open book, open notes, so feel free to use your notes and class videos and your journals. My hope is that the journals are a way for you to review everything that we've discussed over the course of the semester, as well as the attendance questions. And the final project, as you know, is fairly open-ended in that you can decide to write a traditional paper or do something a little bit more creative. I know several of you have touched base with me about your ideas for the final project, so thank you for doing that. And at this point, I think this is going to pretty much put closure onto the semester as a whole with my thank you. I understand that these are challenging times, and I don't know what that might mean in terms of examining something like horror film, but somehow, some way, we've been able to do that. So I thank you for making it through the semester in these most unusual of times. And I do look forward to our being able to meet in person and have a resumption of a sense of normalcy. But in the interim, congratulations for making it just about to the end. I hope you're well. I'm well. And next class, I will post the final examination. And if you have the time, I recommend you rewatch Get Out. I think you'll find a lot of things in a second or a third viewing that you might have missed the first time around. Jordan Peele is quite clever. Take care. Bye-bye.